Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt and welcome to our module on Atlantis, Civilization 1. Now I don't expect this module to give you everything you need to know about Atlantis, and I don't even expect it to be perfect. The idea here is to give you a rough overview of Atlantis, kind of a postcard, but if this is a topic that interests you, I encourage you to delve into the World Wide Web. There are tons of resources available, not just the Disney resort. I actually don't know if it's a Disney resort. Anyway, on to it. Atlantis, referred to here in our presentation as Civilization 1. Proponents of an Atlantis hypothesis argue that Atlantis was a very small but very advanced civilization that existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was wiped out by flood. Now, the first time we find recorded sort of appellation of Atlantis, the first time we see it mentioned by name is in two dialogues from Plato. Now, Plato lived a couple of thousand years ago from us, roughly, so this is pretty old. It's as old, well, it's not as old as we get, but it's fairly old with regard to writing in the Western philosophical tradition anyway. Plato argues that, or states that he gets this story by way of his ancestor Solon, not Solon himself, but it comes to him from Solon, who received it a couple of hundred years ago from an Egyptian priest. So Plato provides what he purports to claim, or what he claims is really just a straightforward retelling of this tale from his ancestor. It's important to note the credibility of Solon. Solon is someone who founded democracy in Athens. He was considered one of the 5 wise founding fathers, I think. And he was one of the first people to have voting in a social structure. So that's pretty high praise, fairly forward-thinking, cherished individual, at least from Plato's point of view. So we'd want to rank any anecdotes that come from that person, perhaps with a good, with kind of give it an initial presumption, right, that it might be good because he does have such good credibility. The general story that Plato tells is that 11,600 years ago, a great flood managed to destroy Atlantis. The next recorded instance we have of Atlantis is from Athanasius Kircher from 1675. This guy was a genius. He's what's called a polymath, which is someone who was, exceptionally good at a number of things, sort of a multi-talented genius. His areas of study were comparative religion, geology, and medicine. He's called the master of 100 arts. And some people consider him to be the founder of Egyptology. That one's a little bit up for debate. He was one of the first people to observe microbes through the microscope, and he even suggested that plague was caused by microorganisms. He invented a magnetic clock and the first megaphone. So he was nobody's fool, and he was doing the best with what he had from the science of his day. Clearly today some of his theories and so forth are demonstrably false. Maybe we would even consider them downright silly, but he was a man who was steeped in learning and of marked intellect. So we have mention of Atlantis from him because we do have this map here from 1675, and it says Atlantis here. It's very tough to see on this render, but he locates Atlantis just about here, which is just about where Plato says it is. Unfortunately, we may have lost some of the sources that Athanasius uses to talk about Atlantis, so we're not sure entirely what sources he used in putting it there. Plato would likely be one of them, though. Now, for giggles, looking at American mentions, early American mentions of Atlantis, and I'm sorry this text is cut off here. This guy has such a great name, you're going to be upset. His name is Congressman Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, the good congressman published a book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. You see a first edition cover over here on the right. And he argued that Egypt at its peak was modeled after Atlantis. And it helped to explain, he thought, how we seem to have this sort of simultaneous graduation or sort of development of humankind across the globe from barbarism to civilization. By the way, I apologize for some of the language here where man rose from barbarism. That's a paraphrase of Ignatius's writing, so it really should read where humans, not where man. It's sort of a relic of his language. Doesn't reflect my own personal beliefs. He argued that, just moving right along, he argued that Atlantis was a vast island continent. It was filled with incredible feats of engineering. The Atlanteans had considerable geographic knowledge of the Earth, and they had even populated the world with colonies. Here's a little question from Ignatius. I'll read it to you, but it reflects his own thoughts with regard to Atlantis and the promise that it held for knowledge. Who shall say that 100 years from now the great museums of the world may not be adorned with gems, statues, arms, and implements from Atlantis, while the libraries of the world shall contain translations of its inscriptions, throwing new light upon all the past history of the human race and all the great problems which now perplex the thinkers of our day? So it's a super long question, and if somebody wrote that in a paper, I'd be upset with such a long question. But the general idea is Ignatius is writing in 1882, and he's thinking to himself, this was an advanced civilization. This hypothesis explains the distribution of skills across the globe and the seemingly simultaneous development in different geographic areas. This is probably the result of Atlantis, and he thought that perhaps in 100 years from his day, so this would be 1982 or so, that you would have volumes of libraries that were filled with works from Atlantis, and there'd be archaeological remains and transcriptions and so forth. It hasn't turned out that way, but it goes to show you, I mean, this was a congressman who in his day held this as a somewhat tenable hypothesis anyway. Modern researchers into the Atlantis hypothesis have contended that that they feel that the survivors of Atlantis were responsible for this almost simultaneous reboot of agriculture across the globe. In other words, they usually argue something along the lines of agriculture is such a strange thing to learn. It's such a dramatic shift from hunter-gatherer to agriculture. It's not likely someone would do that on their own, and so that type of knowledge would have to be transferred. Another source of evidence for the existence of Atlantis for modern researchers is that world mythologies often have contain themes of a lost land or a flood that wipes everything out. So you can see just within our own Judeo-Christian tradition, at least I don't want to say our own, we all belong to different traditions, but within the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a flood tale, right, with regard to Noah. There is a lost island motif in India, and you can find this in Mesopotamia, certain First Nation tribes in Canada. We also see researchers arguing that some of the ancient constructions that we see throughout the world could only be the product of a transmission of knowledge. And this knowledge would have to come from an older, more advanced civilization like Atlantis. So if you'll note, for instance, and Japan also has a lost island narrative. You'll notice that throughout the globe, there are pyramids, right, on different continents and so forth, or pyramid-like structures. And the thought is that the similarities in these structures sort of ask us to find a single cause for them. And the idea is that all of this knowledge would come from one place, which would be Atlantis. So we had a few arguments there for the existence of Atlantis. We have... I'm just cycling through these. All right, let's go here real quick. So we have a few arguments for the existence of Atlantis. We have Plato. Let's let's see, here we go. We have Plato. We have Athanasius's map. We have Congressman Donnelly's arguments, and these are usually distribution of agrarian skills throughout the world. And then we have this similarity in world mythologies too. So that's the brief summary of the evidence for the existence of Atlantis. I would encourage you guys to take a little peek online and see what you can find. You can check Wikipedia, you can check Skeptics Dictionary, you can check Rational Wiki, you can check whatever you want. But you're going to need to bone up a little bit on them. There's a very good podcast from Howard Hughes and the researcher Rand Fem, but I'll list those in the next discussion board video. Hopefully this gives you a good overview.